Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week, we feature interviews with incredible poets and artists, including Olivia Gatwood and A.E. Stallings, and original poetry read by the authors. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas and Portraits of Red and Gray. Cynthia Good is an award-winning author, journalist, and former TV news anchor. She has written 6 books, including Vaccinating Your Child, which won the Georgia Author of the Year Award. She has launched 2 magazines, Atlanta Woman and the nationally distributed Pink magazine for women in business. Her poems have appeared or are forthcoming in numerous journals, including Free State Review, Main Street Rag, and Terminus magazine. Cynthia's new chapbook, What We Do With Our Hands, from Finishing Line Press, will be published this summer. Cynthia is also a frequent speaker and global women's advocate. Cynthia, welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Thanks so much, James. Thanks for having me.
Well, congratulations on your upcoming book, which I really enjoyed reading several times to prepare for this interview. What We Do With Our Hands. It is a powerful, unflinching, and moving collection. When did you first discover a love for writing poetry?
Oh my gosh. Well, really, really late in my life. I had always been a journalist, TV and then in print with a magazine. And that was really my life. And then I got to a point where I didn't really feel I had the tools to say what I felt I wanted to say. And it was a time in my life where, all the stuff with Trump was going on and the media was just, we were inundated with so many of these wild messages. And there was such a disconnect between that and what was happening in my life. And I really, for a moment, thought I was crazy because nobody was talking about these things that were so real and compelling and consuming in my own life. And then I happened to go to, I was starting to do some poetry and I went to the Napa Writers Conference, not far from where you are. And Brian Tier and Camille Dungy, they were talking about this language and they were talking about the fact that sometimes there just aren't words to say what needed to be said. And I had this epiphany that I had discovered this new language, that could be my own. And I was really excited about that. And very late in my life, in my late 50s, I decided to go back and get my MFA, ended up getting my MFA at NYU in Paris. And they have a wonderful poetry program. So that's kind of the snapshot of what happened to me and how I was reintroduced to poetry, because of course I've known about it throughout my life.
Yeah, I love you saying that. That means, for everyone listening, that there is never a point where it is too late to start writing poetry. And my own story is I've written poetry since I was in 10th grade, where I was inspired by it, but it was very sporadic. And I'd go through periods of not writing very much and then periods of getting little bursts. And about 2 years ago, pandemic was very helpful for my writing career. I was thinking, gosh, did I waste all that time? And then I had this enormous burst of creativity and realized, well, you know what? Poetry gets stronger as you build up more experiences. And so it's definitely not too late to start. And it's definitely not too late to kick your poetry writing into high gear. You get more experiences to draw from. So it's terrific to hear you say that.
I think you're so right. And, when I went to this MBA and MFA program, I told my youngest son, I said, I'm pretty terrified, because this is so new. And he says, Mom, you've been doing this in your entire life. And to some degree, he was right, because I have always written since the time I was a young girl. I just didn't always call it poetry,
Very cool. Well, what poets most inspire and challenge you? And by challenge, I'm thinking of something Billy Collins said about reading poetry. He said, read poetry that makes you jealous, that challenges you to grow. So I'd say for me, Billy Collins is one, A.E. Stallings, Olivia Gatwood, or others. But what poets challenge you where you get almost a little jealous and wish you could achieve that level?
Oh my God, I'm looking behind me. So many poets make me jealous. Oh my gosh. And I actually had a stack of books in the other room I was going to bring in. I'm reading Ada Lamone's new book. I think it's called The Hurting Kind. Whenever I get stuck, Adrienne Rich, her collection of poems, which is voluminous, open to any page, and you're overwhelmed. But so many of these poems, I'm looking at Natasha Trethewey, Edna St. Vincent Millay, so many extraordinary poets. I had the chance to work with Victoria Chang, who I love, last summer. It's incredible, I guess, because this community of poets is so small that you can actually have access and workshop with somebody like Billy Collins. So I'm always envious and inspired, and I love that.
And I'd say recently I read Amanda Gorman's first full-length book, and it made me want to try some of the techniques that she uses. It's a wonderful book too. Highly recommend it. So many of the poems in this collection are raw and personal. How did writing these poems help you through painful memories, and how difficult was it to step back and view your poetry critically when they're based in such, strong and personal and raw experiences?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to look at things critically and objectively, and hopefully that's why we have a little support from editors and people around us who can give us some input. But yeah, most of my poetry, I think, comes from a place of frustration, seeing so much censorship, really. And I think it's so easy in our culture to censor ourselves that I try to fight against that. And I think that's one reason why it comes off as so raw. Also, probably unlike a lot of poets, I don't write poems for the reader, and maybe that's mean. I don't write a poem, I want to make everybody feel better. In my other work as a journalist, we put together stories to help women advance and, achieve their life goals and recreate their lives and excel. But when it comes to the poetry, it's something more deeply personal. And I try to make it that raw, honest expression. And I've heard that from some people that it is helpful and they identify with it because maybe they haven't been able to articulate something themselves, and maybe they haven't read anything else exactly like it that helps them understand their own situation. But in terms of it being something that's healing, sometimes I think it helps me sort through things. Other times it makes everything more painful because, as you know, as a writer, James, when you're excavating stuff, you're digging below the wounds, and it can be even more painful. But it's not something I can really control. It's almost like a smoking habit. It's going to happen. I'm going to do it. So whether it's healing or not.
No, it's interesting that you say that, but the act of writing poetry can amplify memories and unearth memories that you otherwise haven't gotten to because writing poetry requires you to get to such an emotional core. That's an interesting observation, that it's both therapeutic and it can also be almost like a flashback that pulls you back in.
Yeah. And I have a question for you. I also find frustratingly that it can be repetitive. Maybe you're just, as a writer, trying to get at something. And so I have this tendency sometimes, flood subjects, right? To keep writing about the same poem essentially over and over and over again. Did you have that experience as well?
Yeah. So I went through an incredible burst of productivity during the pandemic, I think triggered by the stress. And then I worked through that. And then I felt a little bit of writer's block coming on. And I decided I just need to go artificially find a poem. And I looked at cool places in California I hadn't been to. I really like ghost towns. So there's this ghost town in Bodie, California that was a 6-hour one-way drive from my house, but looked like a beautiful drive through the Sierras. And so I just decided Sunday morning, I'm going to get up super early. I'm going to drive to this ghost town. I'm going to spend an hour or two there, and I'm going to drive back, and I'm sure I will get a poem out of it, which I did, and ended up being placed. Ghosts of Bodie, California. So it was so helpful. And if I get stuck, I'll go to museums, just places that do, or I love writing ekphrastic poetry. So I think there is a risk that you start getting repetitive, and then I just try to, like making Brussels sprouts in the oven, shake the pan.
Break yourself out of that environment. I love that. That's a great suggestion. I'm going to definitely check out that poem too.
So one of the things I enjoyed about this collection is the balance between the direct, even profane sometimes, moments and tender moments. A beautiful example is My Father's Ashes, where you write, I have his brown eyes and dark skin. I do not have his certainty, his calm demeanor in crisis, his thin legs. I have his ashes in my hands, fine like dust, except for the pieces of bone we give back to the sea. What a beautiful passage, first of all. But I'd love to know how this poem, so compact and precise, compels being read multiple times. What is your approach to writing just enough, not more and not less?
Some of the poems get so long, and I guess it's part of the editing process, right? But, the chance to put yourself back in that situation, try to reconstruct that relationship that's so dear to you. I read that I think writing about fathers is the number one thing that poets tend to write about. Um, so yeah, I think that sometimes the poem seems to end naturally. Usually when I write, I get to the end and the poem seems to be begging for more, rather than less. So it's nice to write a short poem.
Yeah, I think I was talking to a poet the other day. I think that's something that she's writes short poems and wants to learn how to write long ones. I write somewhat longer poems and occasionally get a good short one. And I think writing short poems is very tricky. And this is a beautiful example. So how do you get into poetry flow? Is there a place or time of day or routine that helps you write?
Well, for sure it can be just driving down the road like, when you were on your road trip. I recently did a road trip from Atlanta across the country to Los Angeles, and there was some writing that took place there. But my favorite process, if I can, and a poem comes when it's going to come, so you get this sense that, oh my gosh, I've got to write that down. And the other night I was sitting here on my patio and there were bats everywhere and I had never noticed them. I guess I thought they were birds. So now this is I've got to write about bats. And this morning, actually, I was doing research. But for me, ideally, an ideal day is to get up, maybe listen to some music, read something, because as we've been talking about, it's so inspiring to read great work and then to spend a little while writing. And that's, my time of day, I think, where I'm at my best. So I want to give that to what's most important to me. And then after that, I can go about my day and deal with the emails and the dog and all of that.
So you mentioned researching bats. I think that's something, and I've mentioned this a couple times in this podcast series of interviews, that research plays more of a role than people realize. Poets write about things they aren't really intimately familiar with, and then they go learn about it. What do you look for when you're researching subject matter?
It's kind of terrifying. It's almost like it looks for me. So as you saw in the book, I had a brief obsession with mushrooms, and so today it's bats, and it's almost like going down this rabbit hole. I was writing a little bit about the bats and I thought, wow, I want to learn more. And then I learned that it's a symbol of death, but it's also a symbol of rebirth. And depending on the culture, in China, the word for bad is also the word for luck. But in the Bible, so you go down this rabbit hole and it can really be never ending. But I don't know why. It's very exciting to me.
Cool. Well, the selected memories of your father are so vividly captured. I've shared one example of that. In between Long Beach and Catalina, you write, I'd breathe in his afternoon cloud of diesel, scotch and cigarettes as he'd show me off to his friends, a pretty girl who could land a fish. So my new book, Portraits of Red and Gray, is a collection of memoir poems. I find the experience of translating memories into poetry magical, that the process of writing unlocks memories. What is your experience with exploring memories through poetry? We've touched on that a little bit, but maybe go a little deeper on do you learn things that you'd forgotten as in the process of writing them down? Certainly that's what I've found. Like, what's this process of writing memories what's been your experience of that?
Sure. I think certainly, when you go back and you kind of recreate those situations from a long time ago, you remember new things. And it's pretty cool. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, well, in Instructions on Washing and Drying and in other poems in this collection, you confront mortality, death, and the journey of dying, a universal experience. And many poets write about fathers. Well, I think death is another topic that just naturally lends itself to poetry. What have you learned from readers moved by your poetry who are facing similar experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it, right? That you feel, well, at least I have, when you go through these major life changes, losing a parent as an example, and you just feel maybe like you're the only one who's dealing with this. And then to be able to write about it and talk to other people about it and realize, no, this is something, I mean, it's natural, right? It's human. We're all going to die. We're all going to lose someone we love. And we're so good in this culture at pushing it out of mind. So it's almost like it doesn't even happen, it seems. And then you deal with it and you're thunderstruck. So to be able to express that on the page and then connect with others who've experienced it too is a pretty magical thing.
And the poem, Because Cockroaches Live in Dishwashers, it's a poem that screams literally to be read out loud, almost a howl, which I did. It was just so fun to read. Passages such as, "You couldn't leave because he planted pear trees in the backyard, took out the trash bags filled with wine bottles and brought in jugs of water. Couldn't because he fell into the Caesar salad during dinner parties." What role does reading poetry out loud play in your writing process?
Well, certainly sound and musicality is so important to a poem, I think. And it's a lot of fun too. You had mentioned that my past life, I was a TV news reporter and anchor, and also a dancer. And I think being surrounded by music, whether it's in the room when you're dancing or hearing the written word expressed verbally, I think brings a whole new layer to it. Just like we look at form, right? How does the poem look on the page? How does it sound? How does it feel in your mouth? So definitely, I don't think of myself as one of the poets is focused on performance and the spoken word, but I love that part of it.
And what I mean, your experience as a journalist, I expect there's multiple threads that would be helpful in writing poetry. Maybe not the writing part so much, because the style of writing is so different, but the research, the awareness of performance. Like what do you feel like you gained in your poetry, if you're able to, and analyze that from the outside looking in, that you got from journalism?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly that's helpful, being really comfortable reading. I could stand up in front of a million people like right now and read, and I would love it. I think that, sense of the presence and the importance of that, the usage of the language is wonderful. The skills in terms of research absolutely have been helpful. But I got to tell you, it's been a huge struggle to unlearn that repertorial approach, because that's not what poetry is. And so I continue to fight against that. And I have been reprimanded many times by my teachers, who say, you really need to let that go. So it's almost like a liability.
Interesting. Well, I saw Billy Collins speak recently, and a journalist came up to the mic asking how they should approach learning poetry, and he made an interesting observation. You'll have to unlearn all the type of writing you do, whether it's you're a novelist or whether you're a journalist, because poetry is just a completely different way of approaching it. So it's interesting to hear you.
Well, right. And also I've had arguments with teachers about what is poetry, and does it, Marie, oh gosh, now I can't blank on her name, but some of the poems that you read, you want to believe they're true, and they're not always true, and they don't have to be true, because this is not journalism. And one of my teachers said, yeah, we had to disabuse you of that idea that it had to be accurate,
Interesting.
Marie Howe, one of Marie Howe's poems, her book, I think Magdalena, was one of those that I thought, because I wanted it to be her story. And it is her story, and it's all of our stories, but because it's art, it's important that it be allowed to be art and be experienced rather than being journalistically sound.
So in Beautiful Things, you chose a prose poetry form that is very effective. How do you find the form for your poetry?
Well, I try to let it evolve naturally, but also one hopes that the form is an expression of the poem as a whole. So in that poem, I wanted it to sort of keep, going on and not have, short lines and short stanzas, because it seemed to work with what I was talking about.
Cool. Well, now I'm going to pass the mic over to you to read selections from your new book.
All right, James. So these are the 3 poems that I picked from my chapbook that's just coming out now called What We Do with Our Hands. And this first poem is called Party in a Pandemic. The dolphins are swimming again in the clear Venice canals, entire populations of salamanders alive without traffic on the roads. And now it's almost June, an entire life already lived as the sun sets behind the elms. We celebrate with Miles Davis and full glasses of Cabernet in a garden like Eden as the world crumbles, bodies piling up in trucks like fire logs left along the path. Remember when you were perfectly happy, your daughter in her yellow apron whipping butter into sweet cream. Everything is exactly as it is. The grass starry with white trillium, leaves reaching from the tips of branches before being swallowed by earth. No suffering or anguish. Such audacity, an entire forest, miles of flower and pine, growing invisibly inch by inch without noticing it's the end of May. So, of course, that was early on in the pandemic, and I was going to a good friend's birthday. And I remember during innocent times when her kids would be around and they'd be literally whipping butter into sweet cream, and just how different times became. This is a short poem. It's called New Year's Day. So long, cell tower dish sneaking in the bedroom window. So long to saying thank you to taxi doors held open only to slide across sticky seats. So long to dragging our bodies into rooms where we don't want to go, into arguments that aren't our own. So long to keeping the shouting quiet, to not wake the kids, to the long marriage, to friends who left town or the earth, the driver who cuts you off in traffic and yells, "Fuck you," with the windshield. So long to war and worrying about my mother. So long, Mom. And maple leaves fluttering up and painting the ground red with stars. So long to day sleeping, to knobby knees on hardwood floors, to breathing and breaking and being broken, to waiting for something better or worse, to being afraid, pissed off, or hungry, to thinking I was lucky for so long. And then this last one is called Controlled Burn, and it is actually the last poem in the collection of poems, What We Do with Our Hands. Controlled burn. Then it sparked into flame, Christmas in the fire pit, a burst 3 times the size when it stood in the den, festooned in bows. The Fraser fir, a shooting spiral of tangerine light. What should we burn next, you ask? Let's burn the stuffed frog your son wasn't here to unwrap. Burn my mother's last wishes and the envelope filled with love notes. Burn all of last year. Burn the acorns in the yard, their little hearts. Ashes float in our coffee like snow in your hair as smoke stings our eyes until we turn our backs to the smoldering. And medallions of shimmering leaves catch the sunrise like Monet's speckled early spring. Take one last look at dents and scars on trees, disappearing under green cloaks, beginnings and endings, surprising as they are inevitable. I'll hold on to the frog. You can't burn anything all the way. It only turns to ash, giving us grace to let go of what's gone.
Well, thank you so much. Those are just wonderful selections. And I've got a couple of questions about 2 of the poems. So Party in a Pandemic is such a complex mix of images and emotions, the surprising joy of nature unleashed by pandemic stillness, mirrored by the horror of the pandemic casualties. I love how you take these bird's eye images and make them personal. The pandemic triggered, as we spoke before, a burst of stress-induced creativity in my writing. What was the pandemic's impact on your writing?
Oh my gosh. I think the impact was the chance to have closer observation of so many things. The trees I had walked past for so many years, I learned their names. So I think it was things like that and the chance to reflect on things maybe more deeply and more quietly So a lot of it was really positive, distracted, of course, by the stress and people getting sick.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioning noticing things in your neighborhood. A lot of houses in our neighborhood got painted because people were noticing the outside of their house in a way that they weren't before. But yes, I think I noticed the little things in more detail because I wasn't in such a frenetic commute back and fro from work where you just sort of get into this almost like an automatic mode and you don't see things anymore. Yeah, I definitely experienced that too. I noticed a lot more detail. Yeah.
Right. That was really cool.
So in Controlled Burn, you visualize the poem very effectively on the page in staggered steps. Your poetry plays with white space in different ways, long lines like howls and staggered staccato bursts. How do you think about the placement of words and phrases on the page, and when does that visualization come to you? Is it in the beginning or afterwards, or it depends?
Well, I think I need to go to Tercet's Anonymous because I tend to write in 3-line stanzas, so I have to guard against that. And oftentimes the form does appear in the very beginning, and maybe I'll leave it, but then I'll revisit it and think about it in terms of the larger picture of the poem. I mean, certainly this one, Controlled Burn, doesn't look like that tree shooting up in flames, but I think you get kind of the feel of it from the form. So I like that. So I try to let, whatever the flow and the tone and the topic influence the form heavily for sure.
And then finally, what are you working on now? What's got you? You mentioned you've got a poem about bats that you're researching, and what other projects do you have underway right now?
Yes, there is that. Just ongoing writing and observation, which is so much fun. I do have a full-length manuscript called In the Thaw of Day that is being shopped around that includes some of the poems in the chapbook, but also many more. So that's what's coming up next. And then we'll take a look at just ongoing work and see what sort of anchor poems exist to pull together different collections from there.
Cool. Well, Cynthia, thank you so much for sharing your poetry with the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast today.
Thank you, James, so much for having me. A lot of fun having this conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you. The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Twitter at Dublin Ranch, subscribe to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, and follow us on viewlesswings.com or on Instagram at Viewless Wings.